Number 10. Clara and Katrina Morova. Clara was actually a very loving and acceptable mother to her two sons, Andrzej and Jacob, where they would take trips and summer camps and she would play with her sons all the time. It wasn't until a new child entered their home by the name of Annika, and Clara and her sister Katrina were part of a cult named the Grail Movement. When Annika came into the picture, it was under the support of Katerina and Clara's sister, where she was told by Katerina that Annika was a 13-year-old who escaped from a trafficking gang that had physically harmed her. Annika was also apparently very sick and suffered many illnesses, which gained Clara's sympathy. Clara wanted to adopt Annika after bonding with her so quickly, and even had a mystery doctor tell her how to take care of Annika. This same doctor told Clara that her sons were a problem and needed to be cured from their evil spirits. It was then Clara would do an equivalent amount of violating and harmful things to her biological sons, like shock therapy, making them eat their own flesh, dunk their heads in water, as well as invite others to her cult to do the same. Annika would also lie to make the aggression towards the boys even worse. It was until a man named Edward had a CCTV camera for his newborn baby when Clara was caught in the act. Clara and her sisters were caught, and it turns out Annika was actually a 33-year-old woman posing as a 13-year-old named Barbara, who had a disease that made her look younger than she actually was. She was eventually arrested as well, which, if you've seen the movie Orphan, it's actually based where this was from. Clara got 9 years in prison and her sister got 10 years, since her sister Katerina actually knew who Barbara was the whole time. Number 9. Cordelia Botkins. However you were in your relationships or affairs, be aware of ex-lovers who might never want to let you go. Cordelia met her lover, a highly regarded reporter, John Preston Dunning, when he was bicycling in San Francisco. At that point, she was 41 years old, 9 years his senior, and although they were already married to their own partners, John was very smitten by Cordelia. John eventually was left by his wife, who discovered the infidelity, but for Cordelia, her husband was pretty cool with it. John also had issues with gambling debts, and he was let go from his job because he was a heavy drinker, so he had to move in with Botkins' hotel. Their affair lasted for about 3 years, but ended when John was rehired to cover the Spanish-American War. When he left San Fran, he told Cordelia, "Baby girl, I am not coming back," and he even reconciled with his wife because he was leaving for Cuba, where he helped survivors of the Spanish battleships during the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Cordelia, however, didn't care for this and wanted him back, so she sent anonymous letters to his wife Elizabeth detailing her husband's affairs. Unfortunately, it got worse when Elizabeth opened a box of candies addressed to her and her sister with the words, "With love to yourself and baby, passionately and fond of candy." Elizabeth and her older sister died from arsenic poisoning, and their father was able to decipher their handwriting from the previous letters to Cordelia, and Cordelia went to life imprisonment. Number 8. Mary Sue Hubbard. It was always in the 1950s where a lot of crap happened that led us to the chaos we know today. And for Mary Sue Hubbard, she is also known as the wife of the founder of Church of Scientology, Ron Hubbard. She was sentenced in the federal court in the 1980s to 4 years in sentence prison for her role in the conspiracy to plant church spies in government agencies, steal government documents, and bug at least one government meeting. She told U.S. District Judge Norma Holloway Johnson that she sincerely and publicly apologized for her actions. Johnson ordered Hubbard, who had been freed pending appeal for her 1979 conviction in the case, to turn herself into the federal officials in 3 weeks, during the time in 3 weeks to begin serving her sentence. Hubbard, who lived in Los Angeles at the time, was the last of 11 church leaders who were indicted in the conspiracy in August 1978 to go to prison. The indictments came after the FBI raided the church headquarters back then in Los Angeles in 1977, and the raids were said to be the largest ever conducted by the FBI at the time. Documents introduced in courts by prosecutors in 1979 contended the operatives of the church initiated numerous break-ins at government official offices, including the Justice Departments, and they secretly placed a listening device in the Internal Revenue Service's conference room, and all in a apparent effort to combat what the church alleged government harassment. Judge Johnston commented that she didn't know whether the government had harassed the church, but she quotes, "Even if I assumed there was harassment, I still can't accept what you did as excusable." Number 7. Natalia Guerrera. Speaking of religious cults, Natalia Guerrera was definitely part of one where she had sacrificed her own 2-day-old infant and burning him to death as part of a satanic ritual. She was finally apprehended by police after evading capture for 2 years. Just 2 days after giving birth, Natalia agreed to have a baby, Jesus, quote-unquote, killed after the leader of Antares de la Luz cult and the father of the child, Raymond Gustavo Castillo Gaete, declared that the infant to be an antichrist and that the sacrifice would help prevent the end of the world on December 21st, 2012. Natalia had previously stated in her defense that she was drugged at the time of the murder, but a forensic psychologist declared that the members were not under the influence when the sacrifice was carried out. After her sentence, Natalia managed to flee and was on the run for 2 years. Investigators noted that she had lived in different houses and even changed her identity in order to evade capture. The police also noted that after being apprehended, she did not show remorse and claimed that she was manipulated by the cult and was therefore innocent. Number 6. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was a convicted serial killer as she targeted only men as an adult worker. She had up to 7 victims and would target specifically motorists, men who would meet her on the road as she acted as a hitchhiker. She was incarcerated at the Florida Department of Corrections BCI death row for women, and she tried to appeal to the US Supreme Court, which was later denied. At that point, she dismissed her legal counsel and terminated all pending appeals. She then would go off to say, in quotes, "I killed those men, I robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again. There is no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'll kill again, and I hate crawling through my system. I am so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times, I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm the one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." After extreme mistreatment she suffered while imprisoned and the inhumane management given to her by the officers, in her final interview she expressed to the media in quote, "You sabotaged me, society, and the cops, and the system. An attacked woman got executed and was used for books and movies and so on." Her final on-camera words were, "Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass." She was later executed by lethal injection.
Number 5. An uncommon plague. I know, no one wants to hear about a plague ever again after recent history, but I promise, this one isn't your typical version. The dancing plague of 1518, or dance epidemic of 1518, was a case of dancing mania that occurred in what is now known as France, from July of 1518 to September. The outbreak began when a woman by the name of Fro Trofea began to dance fervently in the street for a week straight. Oh, my poor ankles. Soon, 3 dozen others joined in on the dancing chaos, with the plague claiming 400 victims by August. By early September, the outbreak began to subside as the dancers were sent to a mountain shrine to pray for absolution. Guess we found where Footloose took inspiration. It's unsure just how many, but a small number of victims actually did pass from this epidemic, which is wild. Historical documents, including physician notes, cathedral sermons, local and regional chronicles, and even notes issued by the city council, are clear that the victims danced, but nobody knows why. There are many theories behind the phenomenon, the most popular being stress-induced mass hysteria. Other theories include ergot and religious explanations. It'd be interesting to see if this ever pops up again in modern times with how stress levels are these days. Hey look, sometimes a girl just wants a flash dance moment without judgment, okay? Number 4. Divorce by combat. Yeah, so people could get divorced, but it was a heck of a process. Divorce by combat appears to have been a form of trial by combat, which was when accusations were dealt with between 2 parties where there were no witnesses or a confession, and whoever won the duel was deemed to be right. The rules for a divorce by combat as we know it come from Hans Stahlhofer's Fruchtbuch. I apologize if I got that wrong, which was written in 1467 and are as follows. The man will be placed in a waist-height 1 meter deep hole with one hand tied behind his back, while the woman was allowed to move freely. Both parties wore practical clothes, which is described as a one-piece bodysuit with stirrup legs. The woman was armed with 3 rocks, each wrapped in a length of cloth to form a kind of swinging club. The man was given 3 normal clubs that matched the length of the woman's cloth to ensure that, their ranges were equal. The man was not allowed to leave his hole though. To further limit him, if he touched the edge of his hole with either his hand or arm, he had to surrender one of his clubs. If the woman attacked him while he was surrendering his club, she in turn forfeited one of her rocks. Yes, the rules place the man at a clear disadvantage, but it's important to remember that it's unlikely that the woman had any kind of combat training. Furthermore, in any kind of physical contest, it is likely the male would have had an advantage in size and strength at the time. So the handicaps placed on the man were to try and make the fight as fair as possible. Which, it's pretty impressive for the time period. The conditions for victory, though, are unclear. Some historians believe that it was unlikely that the fights were to the death. Instead, it was probably down to whoever was judging this thing to decide when one of the fighters had been incapacitated. Since both parties were hitting each other with big blunt objects, it seems likely that many trials ended with one party being knocked unconscious. Thankfully, divorces are a lot less lethal today. Mostly. Number 3. Toothworms. So dentists weren't common in the Dark Ages, but barbers were, and wound up being a one-stop shop for quite a few different services. This guy did it all. Cavity, toothaches, teeth worms, you name it, or in a lot of cases, pull it. Barbers were responsible for cutting hair, pulling teeth, red fluid letting, your classic 3-in-1 appointment. So much more efficient than the silly 2-in-1 shampoo and conditioner combos we have today. This was like the peak of efficiency. Instead of brushing your teeth with tooth tunes, back then you'd rub your teeth and gums with a rough linen. A few recipes have been discovered for pastes and powders to freshen breath, otherwise you were looking at less and less teeth as time went on. As a society, we've gone from powdered charcoal to charcoal toothpaste, which is kinda neat. As time went on, mouthwashes were made from herbs and spices steeped in wine or vinegar and guaranteed fresh breath, but I'll stick with my Crest mouthwash. Thanks! Number 2. No pleasure during procreation. Now, some of you watching might know all about the hanky-panky, and some of you might not. But regardless, you probably know that people do it for fun more than they tend to do it to create a descendant. That's why we as a society have invented things like condoms. Because trying for a spawn is only fun when you really want to. And you shouldn't have to worry about, knocking boots and accidentally creating life. But back in the Dark Ages, there was a law that you were not allowed to get down and dirty unless it was for the purpose of, have an offspring, and you weren't allowed to experience any kind of pleasure when you were doing it, even if it was for the purpose of creating new life. It's like telling somebody to eat food, but you're not allowed to taste anything or enjoy your food. I believe it was one of those rules that people claimed came from God and used for their own uppity bias. There's plenty of those still in place today that I'm constantly rolling my eyes at, but this isn't the time or place for my venting. Thankfully nowadays most folks understand that coitus can be for pleasure and fun and not just spawning new lives. Have fun safely, folks. Number 1, no cheating. So if you were a man back in the dark ages and you got caught having an affair, you'd have to pay a fine, so big whoop. But if you were a woman, like everything else on our list, it was so much worse. Back in the dark ages, women were punished with a situation worse than death in, well, my opinion. Frederick II used to punish adulterers by using rhinotomy, which is the removal of one's, nose. The whole point of this was to make the victim unattractive, but from a needing to breathe point, it would also shorten one's already short lifespan. Another fun body part removal option was losing an ear, and honestly I can't figure out which would be worse, so let me know what you think in the comments.
Rule number 10 is going to be follow the Moral Encyclopedia. For ornery young men and women desperately desiring physical and emotional intimacy, yet having to navigate a dating culture that required them to act a certain way, well, it meant self-help books were all the rage. And women in particular drowned in them, thanks to the fact that these books were often written by hypocritical men and had been used since for medieval time to dictate and instruct women on how to become the perfect submissive little doll. Some examples are Henry Butter's ominously titled Maiden, Prepare to Become a Happy Wife and Mother from 1868, and Hayden Brown's Advice to Single Women from 1899. Perhaps most famously though, on advising the morals of young women was the Moral Encyclopedia by Charles Varl, which had been making young women hate themselves since 1861. It was a bestseller of its day thanks to the marketing that only decent and morally driven women would own it. To prove themselves as that woman, Victorian gals flocked to the bookstores to absorb some menial patriarchal crap that goes as follows. Read no novels, but let your study be history, geography, biography, and other instructive books. Also, trust no female acquaintance, i.e. make no confidant of anyone, because we don't want you ganging up together. Possibly breaking your feeble tongues, having a conversation. Oh, and if you get a pimple, expect nobody to ever love you again. To quote, remember that whereas the character of a young lady is considered angelic, and blemish in it would withdraw the respect men have for you. Rule number 9 is to follow a handbook of etiquette for ladies. Following on a similar sales tactic of gaslighting, only perfect and honorable women know all the rules of etiquette. Oh, you don't? Oh, well, that's such a shame. Now you lose all your honor. You know, though, I can help you out. It's pretty convenient that right here behind me, I have this book I wrote and it has all the rules. I mean, I can give it to you so you can restore your honor if you give me like $30, I don't know. So, what's in this immensely popular bestseller from the 1860s that bullies women? Well, I'm so glad you asked. First up, keep that bling to a minimal, mamas, as you should never wear mosaic gold or paste diamonds. They are representative of a mean ambition to appear what you are not, and most likely what you ought not to wish to be. You got a problem with that? Well, sucks. Pipe down, because it's better to say too little than too much in company. Let your conversation be consistent with your gender and age. Don't forget to never talk about yourself either, as such discussions cannot be interesting to others, and the probability is that the most patient listener is laying the foundation for some tale to make you appear ridiculous. If you do open your mouth and your choice is to be a dirty joke, girl, BFF, because a double entendre is detestable in a woman, especially when perpetrated in the presence of men. No man of taste can respect any woman who's guilty of it. Oh, my personal favorite. Did you break something while a guest in someone else's house? Nah. As a lady, you can't do that. It's not possible. Pretend like nothing ever happened. Don't own up to it and gaslight your host. At another's house, should you break anything, do not appear to notice it. Your hostess, if a lady, would take no notice of the calamity, nor say, as is sometimes done by ill-bred persons, oh, it is of no consequence. Rule number 8 is having a dress for all occasions. Should you not? Well, that's not proper etiquette. As a middle or upper middle class Victorian woman, your job was to spend your day like a Bratz doll, changing every few hours. This is because of the strict etiquette of the time, which dictated that certain dresses were for certain activities, which meant you had to plan your errands around your outfit changes that made it possible for you to run your errands. Isn't that fun? Women would start with the morning time dress, which was relatively comfortable by Victorian standards. However, for us, it would still feel like wearing an iron-reinforced tube sock on our entire body. It was simpler in appearance and designed for only the home. Want to take a stroll in the park? Out of the morning dress and into the walking dress. The skirts are shorter by several inches and didn't have a train, so they weren't dragging a leaf pile behind them as they went. The materials were usually rich in color and pattern to be admired amongst the greenery. When women returned home from their daily walk, they would change into dress number 3, or the afternoon dress for receiving visitors or visiting others. The skirts had a longer train and the neckline was usually a little lower. After some visiting time, dress number 4 gets whipped out for dinner, and it was the most formal of all casual dresses. Usually silks, satins, velvets, exactly the type of precious material you want to spill food on. Ball gowns weren't for regular wear, but they were required for fancy occasions, so you had to own them too. Rule number 7 is to mourn properly. Another dress all women owned was an all-black mourning dress. They kept these bad boys on lock for whenever someone died, which was arguably something to look forward to in the Victorian era. Thanks to Victoria being the most extraordinary and dramatic woman of all time when her husband Prince Albert died in 1861, and she spent a bajillion years dressing like a vampire and wearing black mantillas, it set this bizarre fashion and mourning standard that metamorphosized into literal rules. If one was to ignore these rules, it was seen as incredibly offensive to the deceased. Self-help books dedicated to making men and women better at exerting dramatic woe were pretty common to see on bookstore shelves. So, a mourning rule for women was should her husband die, the widow was expected to mourn for no less than 2 years, while mourning for parents and offspring only lasted a year. Relatives such as grandparents and siblings would only get 6 months. They dole it out like family inheritance is a little weird. Queen Victoria had favored black crepe, and it became one of the only fabrics that was permissible for mourning clothing. Luxurious silks and satins weren't permissible, only itchy and abrasive materials that chafed the sadness right into you. Women would often wear merino or cashmere instead. No jewelry or ornamentation was permitted unless it served a functional purpose like a button or a clasp, or unless it was a bunch of the deceased's hair and teeth braided in a pattern together in the jewelry. Don't forget your big black hat and grandma's doily tablecloth you dyed black to throw over your face and body. Enjoy looking like a corpse for 2 years. Rule number 6 is to glove up. We love to joke about the whole, oh no, if you show your ankle, you're a Victorian W word. But weirdly, hands were actually way more of an issue. The ankle thing was just because men were still trying to look up women's skirts, even when they were so long the ends of them entered a room 15 minutes after the wearer did. Fingers were actually the gasp-worthy thing of the day. It was considered highly inappropriate to walk in public spaces with uncovered hands, and would draw a lot of ill repute to those daring damsels who did. In fact, women's hands were so scandalous, both written and unwritten rules of Victorian etiquette unanimously agreed that if a man and a woman happened to be walking on an unevenly surfaced road, it was the one and only time he could take her hand if they were unwed. Funny that the only permissible contact between the couple, the yet to be engaged, is to prevent her needing to be picked up from a Victorian pile of mud sludge. It does not matter where you are headed outside of your home, you must wear gloves, which weren't just a popular fashion accessory, but as stated, social necessity. Like every other item a woman could wear in this era, there were many kinds of gloves based on the occasion. For example, daytime was for short gloves, which usually bore designs, embellishments, whereas in the evening, gloves had feathers, satin ribbons, and other super flammable decorations. Punishment number 5 is just gross. The medieval and feudal periods of Japan, they hold hands on this one, stretched from 1185 to 1603 CE, and they easily had one of the most disgusting punishments I've heard of for female adultery, suspected or confirmed. It existed from the 12th to the 9th century Japan, however, it was more so practiced in remote villages. A wife accused of adultery was punished by a defacing, and this defacing was done by seed, exactly the type of seed you're thinking, so I'm going to be talking around the subject due to a graphic nature. If a husband suspected that his wife had been unfaithful, he and his friends would take her to a remote area where she'd be restrained, and the men would take turns standing above her and deface her. When the adultery isn't suspected but actually caught and confirmed, the adulteress would be led through the village naked before tied up in the center on her knees. Paper screens would be set up around her so that the men in the village who were urged to participate in this horrific act of public shaming may have privacy while they deface her. The screens only protected the men from indecency. The adulteress would remain exposed for the public to see what was happening to her. Punishment number 4 is working girl. Hard to follow up that last one with anything worse or more gross, but the medieval Japan had an eye for an eye judicial system that balanced crime and punishment. Japan had no gender bias, and crimes done by women were not punished lightly, the way counterparts in Europe or China would have. Equal punishments were imposed for the same crime no matter the gender. So it's a bit strange that arsonists would be burnt at the stake, thieves have their hands cut off, liars lost their tongues and ears, but women committed a petty crime and was sentenced to work time duration as a working girl, which arguably is not even close to payment in kind. Additionally, a woman could have her head shaved as punishment for her crime. In larger empires, this was often the punishment for adultery, which is far better off than the one in the villages. The husband would also be granted an automatic divorce from his now bald and weepy ex-wife. Since punishment was equal, a man got his head shaved too, had to repay dowry, and get publicly shamed, right? No, and his wife wasn't allowed to leave him for it either. Punishment number 3 is scaphism. Back in the medieval Persia, this punishment was death by being eaten alive. It had taken place in a swamp or somewhere where the boats, which would be 2 canoe-like boats or 1 hollowed out tree, could lie exposed to the sun. The victim would be tied inside the space with their head, hands, and feet exposed if possible, at which point the victim is force-fed honey and milk. This is a messy process. It'll splatter and spill everywhere. However, whatever the victim does swallow inevitably becomes diarrhea. The idea was that this would attract every insect, vermin, and wild animal in the area. Very soon afterwards, flies and rats, for instance, would show up and start attacking the victim, eating the mixture of milk and honey, but also eating the person alive in the process. Once the diarrhea kicks in, it attracts other animals, especially the rats, who will begin feasting on you as well and sometimes enter you. Death usually came from septic shock or gangrene because the victim would be force-fed this honey and milk every day until they died, meaning dehydration was no issue. Religious fallacy, coup attempts, and adultery were all punished in this horrific manner, and many women suffered this end. Punishment number 2 is wooden horse. This device was used in Europe and Japan in the 14th to 18th centuries, making it predominant in medieval Europe. Initially, the horse was used on women accused of heresy and witchcraft. The Spanish particularly loved this crude device and they invented it. Sometimes they even styled it to look like a horse. Its back was a triangular wedge women were forced to sit on as weights around their ankles dragged them and their rear and hoo-ha area down on the sharpened wedge. It was covered in part 1 of this video. In Japan, however, they added another particularly horrific element that was not meant to just cause some external tears and pelvic fractures the way the Europeans did, rather cause mass hemorrhaging and death. The concept is the same, wooden horse with a wedge that you'd be forced to straddle while your legs are pulled down. However, the Japanese added an appendage-like structure on the horse's back, which the woman was forced to sit on. The appendage was studded with iron nails and could be rotated via a hand crank from beneath. Naturally, this would cause almost immediate heavy bleeding and internal damage before the crank was even turned. Many would die miserably and quickly, whereas the ones who somehow survived often only did with paralysis. This form of punishment was served on basic offenses, such as adultery or unpleasing her husband. Punishment number 1 is the chest tax. Imagine taxing someone for what's on their chest. Now imagine taxing someone for what's on their chest and for them trying to cover it. Over in India, this was a reality imposed by the king of the erstwhile state of Travancore, one of the 550 princely states that existed in British-ruled India. The chest tax was imposed on lower-class women if they covered their chest in public, and it was to discourage them from doing so. The purpose of this tax was to maintain caste structure, said Dr. Shiva K.M., an associate professor of gender ecology. Social customs on clothing were tailored to a person's caste status, which meant that they could be identified by merely how they dressed. The village legend of Nangali is about a woman who supposedly cut off her girls in an effort to protest against the caste-based chest tax. Nangali belonged to the Abhava caste. Her community was required to pay the tax alongside many other lower castes, but villagers say she decided to protest by covering her chest without paying the chest tax. When the tax inspector heard she was refusing to pay the tax, he went to her house to ask her to stop breaking the law. She still refused and instead cut her girls off her chest in protest instead and presented them to the tax collector in a plantain leaf. According to the local villagers, Nangali died of excessive blood loss while her distraught husband took his life by jumping on her funeral pyre. Her act was selfless and a sacrifice that benefited all the women of Travancore and ultimately forced the king to roll back the chest tax. The chest tax caught wider attention in 2016 when BBC reported Divya Arya reported on a series of paintings by artist Morali T, a far distant relative on the legend of Nangali. He was so moved by the story and the absence of any visual documentation, he decided to paint a likeness of the act she brought upon herself. I did not want it to depict it as a bloody event. Instead, my aim was to glorify her act as an inspiration to humanity, a representation of what would command respect.
Number 10, throwing garbage at the bride and groom in Scotland. Scotland's a pretty old country, so they obviously have some old school traditions that have stood the test of time. But one of the weirdest of the bunch revolves around their weddings and how they treat the bride and groom. Just before the holy ceremony is supposed to take place, friends and family of the engaged couple gather together for an old tradition that is known as blackening. Basically, what happens here is the friends and family throw all sorts of substances at the bride and groom, including mud and rotten food, to make a real mess before the actual wedding begins. It is believed that this old tradition is supposed to prepare the couple for the tough challenges they will face in their new life together and act as a rite of passage into marriage. While it may seem hard to believe that there is a pre-wedding tradition that could steal the actual ceremony's thunder, this one definitely holds a weird and special place in the hearts of the Scottish people. Number 9, no bathrooms for 3 nights in Indonesia. One of the absolute worst feelings in the world is needing to use a bathroom and not being able to find one. The only thing that could be even worse than this is knowing exactly where the bathroom is and not being allowed to use it. While this may sound like some sort of medieval torture method, it is actually an age-old ritual in many southern Asian countries such as Indonesia. The marriage tradition states that the bride and groom must be confined to their home for 3 nights, and they are not allowed to use the washroom during this time. The tradition also calls for their family and friends to smear the couple in rice, flour, and ash, and they use this as a way to symbolize their transition into a new life together. The families and friends will also keep a close eye on the bride and groom to ensure that they do not cheat and use the washroom or wash the food mixture off of their bodies. The Indonesians believe that the couple enduring this challenging period together will serve as a trial by fire and better prepare them for the road ahead. Number 8, mass kissing in Sweden. Okay, so to some people, this may not sound like such a bad idea when you first hear it, but when you consider that it involves a bunch of men kissing the bride-to-be, it does sound a little bit unholy in the eyes of a traditional wedding ceremony. However, these Swedish people have decided that if the groom ever leaves the room during the ceremony, then the male guests who are attending the wedding are free to kiss the bride as many times as they like until the groom returns. This definitely seems a bit out of the ordinary, but it's regarded as a lighthearted joke to keep the wedding fun and laid back. And if you thought the bride was the only one who could be a target of the kissing mania, then you would be wrong. As it turns out, the bride also has an action that can set off a total frenzy at the wedding. If she gets up from her seat at any point during the ceremony, then the female guests are allowed to kiss the groom until the bride returns to her seat. There probably aren't too many countries around the world where this would be accepted, but Sweden has fully embraced the kissing tradition. Number 7, beating the groom's feet in South Korea. This one is probably just as painful as it sounds. After the wedding ceremony has completed and the newlyweds have started their new life together, the groom's first taste of married life is getting his feet absolutely destroyed by a whole host of painful objects. In South Korean culture, the groom's family and friends will tie his ankles together after the wedding and hold him down on a table while they search for whatever items they can find to beat his feet with. The items can range from sticks and rods and even dried fish, and the groom must endure the painful ritual until the family and friends decide that they are satisfied. On top of that, the ones doing the beating will usually ask the groom some strange riddles and trivial questions to add a bit of a humorous twist to the bizarre ritual. The beating is supposed to be a way to test the groom's strength and character, and although it may have a lighthearted feel to it, there's no way the groom wouldn't be feeling the pain for a long time after it was all over. Number 6, carrying fire in South Africa. There are many interesting wedding traditions that take place in South Africa, but one of the oldest and wildest of the bunch is the fire carrying. This old South African tradition calls for the parents of the bride and the groom to bring fire to the home of the newlyweds. It must be pretty hard to transport a burning fire from house to house, but this tradition holds a special place in the heart of many South Africans and provides a blessing to the bride and the groom. The fire is meant to symbolize the coming together of the newlyweds and ignite the hearth in their new home. This is why it is important for the fire to be transported directly from their childhood homes by their own parents, because it will ensure that the family legacy is carried on for eternity. So while some people might think this is a little bit crazy and a bit of a fire hazard, it is an important South African tradition that will most likely last forever.
Number 5, Walk of Shame. Remember in Game of Thrones when Cersei Lannister was made to do like the Walk of Shame? Yeah,
That is a real thing that happened to women in history. The scold's bridle was also sometimes made to be worn by women who were then paraded through the town and in said mask just to humiliate them further. And there's a few different things people would parade people in town with, but the mask is one of them. As if just being forced to wear that mask wasn't awful enough. I don't think you need to parade someone around or chain them to a fireplace. I think you can just leave it at the mask, to be honest. Your point would be made. In fact, I don't even think you need the mask at all. Just don't try to make a point to begin with and then we're all good. How about instead we just let women exist and be heard? Just a thought from a woman who's living in 2023, ye old past. Talking to you, past, back there. Yikes. Number 4, hand clamps. Honestly, this sounds like one of the most horrific and worst things I've heard of. And it might not sound bad to people, but I don't know. I just imagined what this would be like and I was like, that's horrifying. This method of torment was popular during the feudal period of China. It was used all the way up till the 19th century. What did it involve? Forcing women to put their hands into a tool that would then squeeze the tip of their finger. Doesn't sound that bad when you're thinking of it on the surface level, and in terms of the surface area of your finger. But this pain was actually so bad because of the pressure that it would cause many to just pass out. But once you passed out, they would just splash some cold water on you and force you to stay awake so you could experience every single second of pain awake. It wasn't reserved for just the hands or fingers either. There were also tools like this used to apply pressure to the feet and the head even of suspected offenders. Yeah, this method of course wasn't even saved for people who were convicted of adultery, which honestly I don't even think you should torment people physically like this anyways, or mentally. Even if they're guilty of it, let's just be adults and move on. It was used on both guilty and innocent folks. I am sure, I'm 100% positive. All you had to do was be suspected of adultery for this brutal form of punishment to be administered. So you don't even need any, back then I don't even think people had proof. They were just I have a feeling, so do something terrible to this woman. Number 3, ducking stool. Despite being more well known for its use during witch trials, the ducking stool was also something that was used to torment women in the 19th century as well. In fact, documentation of its use exists from as late as 1896. That seems pretty late to me. That's wild. Although I obviously wasn't alive at that time and it was over 100 years ago now, it does not feel that long ago relative to our history and time spent on this earth. Oh boy. A ducking stool was basically a chair, a variation of another stool type used to humiliate people. However, in the case of the ducking stool, you were more than humiliated, you could actually die. Women would be tied to the ducking stool, basically a chair, and then lowered into the water. During the witch trials, this was one of the methods used to discern witches from innocent women. The problem being that witches would apparently survive the process thanks to their wily powers, whereas women would be proclaimed innocent if they could not float, swim, or survive this process, meaning that many that were then deemed innocent wouldn't survive the ducking process. So it seems like a flawed way to test that, you know what I mean? If someone's innocent, I feel like they shouldn't end up dead, but I don't know. Only the witches get to live, and even then they don't get to live. No one gets to live. Are you a woman? No life for you. Sorry. You just gotta move on. That's history for you. Number 2, foot binding. While not a punishment for any misdeed, foot binding was a cultural practice that has often been tied to sexist ideals for women that were created not necessarily by them, but by society at large. The idea with foot binding was to break the bones of young girls' feet so that their feet could be shaped into a small and dainty size. From a young age, their feet were broken, bound, and conditioned so that they would be and remain small into adulthood. While no longer something practiced today, foot binding is an ancient practice that is believed to have originated somewhere around the 10th century. The decline began though around the mid-19th century. That's 9 centuries of foot binding, after questions were raised about the practice in the 18th century. Number 1, nose cutting. Probably one of the most brutal punishments out there for suspected adultery or promiscuity is the method of nose and ear cutting. This is when women have their noses and or their ears removed. This is done to disfigure the woman and take away the power of her beauty as punishment for whatever misdeed she's accused of. In many cases, women have been punished in this way without even actually being proven to have done anything that is even deemed wrong by whatever moral code you're subscribing to.
by whatever whack moral code you are subscribing to. Some women have even been punished this way simply for defending or protecting themselves or others. Typically, nose cutting is reserved as a punishment for women. It happened not just in the 19th century, but before and even after that as well.
Coverture, also known as martial unity or femme covert, was a legal doctrine that existed in many Western societies until the 19th century, but also, in some way they're still kind of there. The concept of coverture significantly impacted the legal status and rights of women upon marriage. Once the central aspects of coverture was the merging of a woman's legal identity is that of hers and her husband's were as of one upon marriage. This meant that in the eyes of the law, a married woman and her husband became a single legal entity. Any property that she owned, including real estate and personal belongings, would become her husband's upon marriage. She could not enter into contracts or control her own finances independently, and in cases of divorce or separation, the legal custody of children were almost always granted to the husband, as the legal doctrine considered him to be the head of the household. The impact of coverture varied across different jurisdictions and evolved over time. While coverture was deeply ingrained in legal systems for centuries, it faced increasing criticism during the 19th century and eventually underwent reforms. The movement of women's rights, including the first wave of feminism, played a significant role in challenging and dismantling coverture laws. Number 9. Corset Regulations. During the late 19th and early 20th century, there were instances of corset regulations in some regions. Particularly in the United States, these regulations were attempts to address concerns about women's health and their public morality and the potential impact of corsets on the female body. Some US states and cities enacted laws that specifically specified the maximum length of corsets. These regulations were aimed at preventing the creation of extremely long corsets, which were considered not only a fashion concern, but also a potential health risk. Enforcing corset regulations proved challenging as it required monitoring and measuring women's undergarments, which were both impractical and invasive. Compliance was difficult to ensure, and these regulations were not universally followed or reinforced, as over time, societal attitudes towards women's fashions and health evolved, and the popularity of corsets waned. Ultimately, the decline of corsets in women's fashions was driven by challenging aesthetics, fashion preferences, and evolving views on women's health. Number 8. Anti-flirtation laws. Anti-flirtation laws were laws or ordinances that at various points in history sought to regulate or prohibit what was considered inappropriate or aggressive flirting behavior in public spaces. These laws were often subjective and reflecting societal norms and values about modesty, decency, and public conduct. The term anti-flirtation laws is commonly associated with the early 20th century in the United States. During this period, some cities enacted laws or regulations aimed at curbing what authorities deemed as inappropriate or unwanted flirtatious behavior. In some cases, though, anti-flirtation laws were actually presented as a measure to protect women from unwelcome advances or harassment. The laws were framed as a way to ensure that a woman could move through public spaces without facing unwanted attention. Enforcing anti-flirtation laws posed challenges, as the laws were vague and determining what constituted inappropriate flirting was inherently subjective. The laws were sometimes criticized for being overly intrusive and arbitrary. Anti-flirtation laws faced criticism from various quarters. Civil liberties advocates argued that such laws encroached upon individuals' rights to free expression and personal interactions. As societal attitudes became more permissive, the enforcement of these laws ended up becoming increasingly unattainable. Number 7. Unequal inheritance laws. Historically, many societies had laws governing inheritance that were unequal and discriminatory, favoring male heirs over female heirs. These laws, rooted in patriarchal norms, often restricted women's rights to inherit property, land, or other assets. Practice like primogeniture is a system of inheritance in which the firstborn son inherits the entire estate of the parents, as this practice excludes daughters and younger sons from inheriting significant portions of the family's wealth. The Borough English system was also a variant of primogeniture in which the youngest son inherited the family estate, while the elder sons received other forms of compensation. Like primogeniture, it disadvantaged daughters in terms of inheritance. While dower rights provided some protections for widows by granting them a portion of their husband's estate, they were often limited compared to the inheritance rights of sons. Dower rights varied, and in some cases widows received only a life interest in a portion of the estate. Over time, reform movements and challenges and changes in societal attitudes led to legal reforms aimed at addressing gender-based inequalities in inheritance. These reforms sought to ensure the daughters had equal rights to inherit all the family property, or whatever is in the will. Number 6. Restrictions on working hours. Restriction on hours for women were common in various parts of the world, often based in societal norms, gender roles, and concerns about women's well-being. These restrictions were part of the labor laws or social norms that limited the hours when women could work, the type of jobs that they could engage in, and in some cases the conditions under which they could work. Laws and regulations in many places historically imposed restrictions on the number of hours women could work in a day or a week. These restrictions were often based on the assumption that women needed protection and rest during their roles as caregivers in the family. Certain professions and industries that explicitly exclusions for women, limiting their participation based on perceived physical or emotional limitations. For example, some jurisdictions restricted women from working in certain heavy industries or underground mining. Over time, however, changes in social attitudes and evolving perceptions of gender roles contributed to the relaxation of restrictions on working hours for women. As the women's rights movement gained momentum, there was an increase in recognition of women's rights to work without undue restrictions. Number 5. Strangulation. Now for the more morbid section on this list, although stoning may seem like a common thing in this era as a form of capital punishment, whereas an individual is pelted with stones until death actually was not common associated with ancient Egyptian legal practices based on available historical and archaeological evidence. The primary method of execution in ancient Egypt was typically strangulation or impalement. Stoning as a form of capital punishment is more commonly associated with other ancient cultures in the region, such as ancient Mesopotamia or parts of the Levant. In these societies, stoning was indeed known as a form of capital punishment for various offenses, including adultery. Strangulation was one of the most common methods of execution in ancient Egypt. It was typically used for serious offenses and could be applied for both men and women. In cases where capital punishment was deemed necessary, strangulation was a method employed to carry out the sentence. Number 4. Lacerations. When it comes to corporal punishments, as I mentioned above, those who do commit adultery might deal with the consistency of beatings or lacerations. Texts speak of thrashing with a wooden stick, give 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 or even 200 times. They also mention branding and mutilation of the nose and ears. Tomb reliefs often show beatings of people, but in most cases these are private coercions of subordinates, not an official penalty. Sometimes the culprits are bound to a pillory. These punishments were all carried out in public and therefore also meant a loss of honor and degradation of the culprits. The results of these measures can be seen on many skeletons, as they are also including cutting off limbs, noses, and other parts of the body as a form of punishment, specifically connected to adultery or if you were married, specifically a married woman. It is a crime deserving of death, as it is easier to commit any other sin after that. The husband had a legal right to punish or forgive his wife or leave the court if the husband accuses the wife with no proof. The punishment of a man was much lighter, and the woman of the crime of adultery, as the Egyptians believed, that offense falls primarily in the hands of the woman, while the women would be killed as the men would severe just 1,000 blows. Number 3. Burning alive. Referring back to the Code of Hammurabi, the code was enlisted under the morals and the laws in ancient Egypt and Babylon. When it came to intimate relationships with your close family, you'd be subjected to many listed punishments, as in dealing with seduction or physically harming someone intimately. The Hammurabi inflicts the penalty of burning if you were to have a physical intimacy with your mother, but since this was ancient Egypt, unless you were royal who needed to pull an Oedipus complex to maintain your rule and connection to the monarch position, it wasn't something looked down on but normalized, as this is a civilization that needed a monarch rule at all times to guide the nation. But it is good to note that it was a typical Western interpretation that this era was prone to burning alive people, when the irony was that the Europeans burning women, being witches or even more heresy, were more burned. Number 2. Head be gone. The ancient Egyptians set harsh punishments for those accused of treason or corruption. The death penalty was usually applied by impalement, thumping, or a 100-fold fine, and this applied to both men and women. The decree also referred to the death penalty for someone who steals an animal belonging to the temple and transfers it to another party, while confiscating the property of the thief in favor of the stolen temple. The ancient Egyptians distinguished between the stolen goods and the bear the attribute of holiness and considered it a religious crime that requires execution, and those stolen goods that do not affect the sanctities, settling for the penalties of beating and the fine for the theft 100 times of the value of the stolen items. Number 1. Buried alive. Of course, all of these leads to death eventually, as the punishments were drastic, dangerous, violent, and vile. I mean, if you somehow survived the beheading, then what a miracle that would be. Number 10. Thews or stalks. Gossiping now is always seen as a bothersome and terrible construct where rumors are spread and information is sent from one end to the room to the other, when in actuality the original history of gossiping was used as a survival tool since time. However, due to the trickling events that would occur in the 12th century to the 21st century, gossip has been accompanied by the dangerous stigmatization of women. And with that in mind, they would be accompanied with a crime of humiliation for gossiping by being locked up by the neck and left outside at the mercy of the mocking crowd. The thew was a type of pillory similar to to stocks specifically for women, and the woman would be chained to a post by her neck as a punishment for her crime. Unlike men, her hands weren't tied up, and common crimes include annoying your neighbors by talking too much or consummating outside of marriage. As for example, one woman named Anne Morrow in 1777, she was accused of impersonating a man and marrying another woman. She was put in the pillory and an angry crowd stoned her in resulting of her being blind. Number 9. Iron cages. They really didn't like it when women gossiped, or in most cases talked back in the day, especially when she would speak up or just discuss things. But words can only help you unless you speak them, and it's disappointing when people fail to understand that. Women who nagged would have metal spikes forced into their mouths, and the scold bridle was an iron cage for a woman's face, used to punish scolds, women who nagged, gossiped, talked back, or just talked too much. The bridle would be locked onto your head, and the protruding piece of metal covered in spikes would be forced inside your mouth, and every time you moved your tongue, the spikes would lacerate it. Sometimes the bridal woman would be chained to a hook by the fireplace in her home until she had learned her lesson, or she might be led through town wearing the mask to increase her humiliation. Number 8. Duck the scold. Unfortunately, another form of torment and punishment for women being tied to a chair at the end of a long, maneuverable wooden arm and dipped into frigid water. The punishment wasn't designed to be fatal, although sometimes it was, but rather a humiliating spectacle aimed at discouraging whatever behavior participated in it. There were various rituals for silencing women, as they have their roots in fear of women's speech and fear that women will attack other people in their community, that they gossip too much, that their voices were dangerous, and that they may, in extreme circumstances, also be witches. Though the women who ended up being on the ducking stool risked being accused of witchcraft, and the punishment, contrary to popular misconception, wasn't used to determine whether someone was a witch. A separate test, primarily known as the swimming witch, involved throwing a bound victim into a body of water to see if they'd float, a sure sign of guilt in the modern imagination. Subjects who sank were deemed innocent but could still wind up dead if they weren't rescued from the water in time. Few records about the women who were ducked survived. Much more information is available about the ducking stools themselves, their upkeep, about how they were kept into their construction. Number 7. Marking and tattooing. Although in some cultures tattooing isn't seen as a bad thing, but part of their heritage and even a source of pride. But in some cases they would use it as a means of marking an individual for their shame. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, famously marks its protagonist, Hester Prynne, with a red letter A for adultery for accusations about her behavior circulated. Hawthorne's book is more than fiction, as adulterers were really forced to mark their clothing to identify their crimes. Like Hester Prynne, A or the letters AD as outlined by a Plymouth colony law from 1658, adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subject to public whipping and even further humiliation and social alienation. But keep in mind, Hawthorne was the descendant of the Judge Hathorne, who persecuted the lives of women who were accused of being witches, and he had such a disdain for his relative that he had changed his last name to distance himself from the relation of Hathorne from Hawthorne with a W. Number 6. Walk of Shame. Like in Game of Thrones, a pretty well-known show, I don't know if you guys heard of it, I'm rewatching it again up to a certain specific season. But there was that scene where Cersei was condemned for her crimes and had that lady yell shame as she rung a bell while Cersei was left parading the streets stripped naked. This is actually based as a form of torment for women, and the Walk of Shame, also known as skimmington or rough music, was a traditional punishment for harlotry or being an overbearing wife. Women were made to walk barefoot through the town or city, sometimes dressed only in their petticoat. The street was filthy and sharp with rough stones, jeering crowds lined up to stare, and minstrels banging basins and pans would accompany the procession, adding to the woman's humiliation. Sometimes the skimmingtons were delivered by the townsfolk rather than the courts, and the accused might be dragged from their bed at night and paraded through the town with the crowd shouting obscene words at her. Unless she was quiet, subdued woman who followed every little thing she was supposed to do, she would be looked down on. Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution, but for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are sadly identified only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor, as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4. Domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being degrading and harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3, the angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husbands' control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it, as it got worse as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors in marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, and a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. Because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectful household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past.